So now you're enlightened. That's all you had to do. So obviously that takes a lot of practice, right? You're not, I mean, you may be enlightened, I don't know, but it takes a lot of practice, years and years to develop that into a habit, until finally, perhaps you don't even need to meditate, that your life simply becomes that way of behaving. And that way of behaving will serve us well today as we sally forth into the question before us. You see, we stand together, you and I, on the brink of a rabbit hole. One of those Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, Jefferson airplane kind of rabbit holes, with all the surprising self-discovery and ambiguity found in such places, just whispering around the lip. Now this hole, as all such rabbit holes are, is uncovered and opened by the asking of a question. As with all rabbit holes, there are then layers and layers and rooms to pass through. And the question keeps shifting so that the ones we wind up with may not be the ones we began with. Now, as we stand together on this precipice, I feel like it would be a good idea to find someone to blame for this moment. And luckily, I have someone in mind. I rarely have the answers. When I do, it's a good feeling. And the answer to who to blame is Marian Erickson. Yes. So if this reflection begins to rankle, I suggest you talk to her. We are here because of Marian Erickson at this moment. And if you don't know Marian, I'm sorry to tell you it is too late to call her to account to her face. Marian died earlier this year. She was and is still beloved here. So you will have to call her to account to her face as it appears in your face, if you wish to speak with her. Anyway, it was just as she was getting sick that she and I began to chat about something called the First Principle Project, which seeks to broaden our first principle. You see, Marian was a great lover of animals and nature, and the First Principle Project addresses that. And I'll tell you about it more in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself because there's some backstory to do first. So as her health worsened, her insistence that I reflect with you all on this project became more pronounced. She knew that she wouldn't be able to lead the effort for you. And while it wasn't quite so dramatic as a promise made at her last gasp, promise her I did. In her dying days, assure her that I would bring this to you for serious reflection. Now, it's not all Marian's fault. She shares the blame with our incredible and amazing living tradition. I'm so in love with Unitarian Universalism right now. We are a religion without dogma or orthodoxy that has democracy and integrity as ordering principles, and that is the most amazing thing. I love that. I mean, that is unique in history. In human history, but that's redundant, right? It's unique in history. And you have any idea how cool that makes us all here? It makes you incredibly cool. This is what cool feels like. Our principles were developed, by the way, the principles around which we organize, that bind our association together, they were developed in committee and ratified democratically and are by no means written in stone. We are a tradition steeped in evolution, both as a biological description of reality as well as a mode of being, a tradition. So the first set of principles of the UUA were not even called principles, but purposes. Oh, that's too bad. You can't read that at all. Okay. All right. Well, they were called purposes, and they were adopted when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1960. And you can't see them on the slide there, but I'll make them present in the online version. If you were able to see, you could see that the purposes and privilege both our Judeo-Christian heritage and men. There's a lot of language like brotherhood, mankind, Judeo-Christian, etc. And as we evolved, that emphasis seemed at odds with our understanding. And so began a conversation and process about changing them. Adopted in 1960. So our current principles and sources were adopted in 1984. The ones we oh, Ricky, nice. Evolving in the middle of a sermon on evolution. Anyway, our current principles and sources, the ones that we read today together, they were adopted in 1984 after a 5-year process, and includes something that those original purposes did not even hint at the least. You can see here that a number of the things that are in our purposes were indeed brought forward into our current principles, but the interconnected web of existence of which we are all a part is not here, and it is sort of unique to our new principles, our current principles. And I tell you all this to demonstrate the intentionally evolutionary history and trajectory of our tradition. We are indeed a living tradition. As such, a new proposal is being considered. And at this point in that process, it is in the very early phases, the embryonic phase, with its sponsors seeking to attain 15 congregations. There are currently 14 signed on. They're seeking 15 congregations who deem the question worthy of consideration and discussion before the General Assembly, which meets once a year. So the important thing to note is that 15 congregations need not endorse the ends of the proposal, but rather endorse discussing the proposal in a national conversation. So our first principle currently holds that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The first principle project's proposal that Marion asked me to ask you to reflect on is to change the language from every person and replace it with every being. If we passed that resolution after the process was finished, if it passed unedited, it would be that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every being. As I revealed the goal of the first principle project, you had a reaction. You thought, that's kooky bananas. Or you thought, right on. Or something. You thought something. You had a reaction. And that is fine, just so you understand, whatever the reaction was, that it was a reaction. Do not mistake that for reflection, and do not allow that reaction to set the trajectory of your reflection. So, the rabbit hole gapes before us. And as I stare into it, I'm reminded of one thing. I love rabbit holes. And I'll tell you straight away that I remain delightfully unresolved as to whether I would vote yes or no on this proposal for final adoption in our principles at General Assembly. I say that I am delightfully unresolved because I think it raises some questions that have the potential to goad us as a tradition into some thorough introspection, and this I love. Now, if it ever comes up as a vote for this congregation to sign on to endorse the proposal for discussion across the association, therefore, I would then, without hesitation, vote in the affirmative. For me, that would be more a vote for reflection than necessarily an affirmation of the goals of the proposal. As I said, I think the proposal compels us to examine some very interesting questions and implications. And now, both of those possibilities, both our congregational vote and the vote at GA, are a ways in the distance. But if you are intrigued or compelled or repulsed or offended or enraptured, affirmed or challenged by this proposal, then I invite you to come back into this room after you get your coffee after service, and we will chat about it as a group and discover if there is any energy to continue the discussion into the future. I hope there is. But now I would just ask that you take a moment, listen to the music, think what your reaction was, see if you can move beyond it, and discover the rabbit hole at your feet. That's better. So, there's a semi-joke that the religious symbol of the Unitarian Universalists is a question mark. I'm not a fan of that joke. It either means the question mark is our symbol because we don't know what the heck we're about, like, huh? Or it means that we are more interested in questions than answers, which sounds awesome, but in my experience is often an utter load of self-aggrandizing crap. We come to this game with a frequently ironclad case of assumptions and stories that have often risen to the level of a personal orthodoxy, dare I say dogma. And in that case, what the question mark really means is that we feel entitled to ask questions of others while leaving our own assumptions merrily aloof. Of that habit, I am only interested in breaking. There is neither spiritual profit nor development in it. It is inert and spiritual death. So let us commit to integrity. Questions give life when they are applied to oneself. Let us not reserve our inquisitive punctuation marks for others, but direct them to ourselves. And that is why I love this proposal. To change every person to every being asks us to confront assumptions and ultimately to rediscover who we are. We cannot afford to take ourselves for granted. We change. We construct castles of character out of sand and pretend that there is no weather. But there is weather. And that is why, as people, as a people, we as individual persons need to practice being who we are. It takes practice to maintain a sense of self. And that practice actually constantly occurs, either consciously or unconsciously. Unconscious practice of self-creation is what gets us our reactivity and what gets us into trouble. Meanwhile, the conscious practice of self-creation, I think, is a fitting definition for the spiritual life. Conscious practice of self-creation is spirituality. What's more, the conscious practice of life is made most possible and legitimate when pursued in company. And that is called religion. So let us be conscious of our self-creation together. Let us be reflective. Let us ask questions of ourselves, and let us ask questions of our questions. One of the immediate questions to occur when considering whether or not every being has inherent dignity is to wonder if it is only humans, then, that have inherent dignity and worth. Not your dog, not your iguana. Now, maybe this is the case. Maybe we have inherent worth, and a monkey or a pig does not. Maybe that's the case. But we cannot leave that unexamined. We need to wonder why. Why humans and not animals? Is it because we're self-aware? A sense of past and future? Is it because we have language and make tools? But there are animals that can do all of that. Is it because we do that better than they do? More than they do? But once you start saying yes to that, you get into wondering if it, I know some humans that do self-creation and self-awareness better than other humans. And I know some animals who do some things better than us. So is dignity based on behavior? And if so, how is that inherent? Why would we possess inherent dignity if other beings do not? Is it because we are the alpha predator? So does predation make for dignity? Is it because we are the deciders of the planet? That seems awfully self-referential. So this is a map. This is a map of life. It's basically every evolutionary tree combined, and the brilliant minds who did it felt that this was the best way to represent it. I don't anticipate that you will understand what it is. I've looked at it a long time. It's not meant necessarily for my brain to figure out, but the one thing I do know is that the inner circle represents the 2.3 million known species. And we are, hang on. We are here. The Deuterostomia. Scientists. Deuterostomia. And this circle represents all the known species. This circle represents all of the anticipated species. The 8 million, we know 2.3, they think that there's 8 million species on the planet. In that case, our little bar shrinks down to here, and you can bet that we are just a fraction of this. Most of it is sea stars, urchins, some worms. This is vertebrates, right? This is vertebrates, basically, with some urchins thrown in. So think of all the vertebrates. So of this whole deal, we're one line. So, this is also a map, by the way, of evolution. And this reminds me of, because each thing starts in the center with the one bit of life, and everything, it trees off of that. So, it reminds us that each line has come from something else. Each of those lines has come from something else and shares a common ancestry. This illustrates the fact that each being is composed of smaller organizations, of smaller organizations, of smaller organizations. That we are, in fact, an organization of organizations. And then you come here, and this is an organization of organizations of organizations. So what implications does this have? It reminds me of two things. One, the scale of our biological impact relative to the scale of all life. Two, it reminds me that a person might not be any one being, but rather a composite of many beings. So what does that have to do with the inherent worth and dignity of every person or every being? I mean, it has something to do with it. I'm asking, what does it have to do with it? And if human beings are derivative and an organized composition of smaller organizations and also part of a larger organism, be it an institution or a planet, an ecosystem, then what is a person? Come into the rabbit hole. Questions abound. Can other organizations of organizations be dignified? Can an amoeba be dignified? Can flies? If not, why not? Does a redwood have dignity? If so, why? Because it's big? Because it's old? Because of how it makes us feel? Because we say it is? So we're reflecting on inherent dignity and even personhood here. What is a person? What is inherent dignity? How is it that we have it? And we could do the same for worth. Is a species worth relative? What would that imply? Does that relativity creep from between species to within species? Are we of relative worth to one another? We can probe on what being means in this statement, from changing from every person to every being. What does being mean? Sentient beings, living beings, rocks, atoms, soil? Worth and dignity. And this is, I think, rich religious soil. I think this is worthy work. This is, in fact, one of our primary reasons for existing and organizing as a religion. The free and responsible search for truth and meaning become irrelevant if we stop searching for truth and meaning. I frequently hear that it is rewarding when we plumb other religions for wisdom, and I agree. But the trick there is that we trap ourselves between rejecting their methods, after all, we are not them, while needing their wisdom to somehow legitimate ours. But the fact is, we have all the wisdom that we need right here in this tradition. Right here in this room. And I would even say right here in that organization of organizations and that organization of organizations. But those two specifically, nobody else. All we have to do is ask questions in earnest and compassionate ways and keep asking. I don't think these questions are what motivated Marion to ask me to bring this proposal to you for reflection. we did talk about it. And she was aware, happily, that they would be part of the discussion. But for Marion, the prime mover, so to speak, was love. She loves animals. And she sees something in their eyes, be it the eyes of a pig or the eyes of a tarantula. She once told me that instead of killing a black widow that was in her house, she moved it outside. That's intense for me. But she sees something in the eyes of animals and in your eyes that begs us to ask this question: does every being have inherent worth and dignity as we do, or not? Marian asked that I promise that I would ask you to think about it. And I'm very glad that she did. I'll see some of you after church.